Good day. Today is Thursday, 26th November, and with respect to the conflict in Ukraine, we have had three important developments. The first is a massive Russian missile strike that has been taking place across Ukraine, which, according to the media today in the West, has left around 1 million people across Ukraine without electric power. For the record, I think that is almost certainly a significant underestimate, but I will return to this missile strike later in this program. We have also had, however, two other developments which each in their respective way are extremely important. One is a speech that President Putin has given at a meeting of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. This is the military alliance that the Russians have created on the territory of the former Soviet Union. This alliance has had a meeting in the Kazakh capital of Astana. Putin was received in Astana by the Kazakh President Tokayev with all the ceremony and honor and pomp and circumstance and one might have expected. But anyway, it was all laid out for him in a huge way, and there's been an extremely friendly series of comments by the leaders of these two countries with respect to each other. There's been lots of discussion in the media about possible tensions between Russia and Kazakhstan. I've never seen much sign of that myself, at least not since President Tokayev came to power, and I have to say there wasn't the slightest hint of that in the very detailed speeches and very fulsome speeches that the two presidents, Putin and Tokayev, made over the course of their meeting. But anyway, I'm not going to discuss Russian-Kazakh relations in this program. I'm going to focus instead, in a moment, on an absolutely extraordinary speech that Putin gave at this meeting of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And again, one of the most remarkable speeches he has ever given, and the first of its kind that he has given since the start of the conflict in Ukraine. The third big piece of news, rather, the first was the missile strike, the second was Putin's speech, the third is the appointment by President Donald Trump of General Kellogg as his peace envoy to Ukraine, to try to settle the conflict in Ukraine. Now, I've said many things about General Kellogg in various programs, and I've just done a program with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. I've now read through carefully the purported peace plan that has been associated with him, and I'm going to discuss General Kellogg and his appointment later in the program. But I will say that now, having finally read this so-called plan, a plan which has been attributed to him extensively in the media, I have significantly shifted my opinions about him. And I will anticipate by saying that I'm doing so I'm more encouraged about this appointment than I was initially when I first heard about it. Before I proceed, I should acknowledge my debt to the historian Jeff Roberts, who tracked down the original document published by the America First Policy Institute, where Jeff Roberts finds the time to track all of these things down. I wonder, but all I will say is I'm incredibly grateful to him for having done so. And having now read the document itself, I found it significantly different from what I had been led to think about it. And as we will see when I get to discuss General Kellogg, I'm going to I've revised my views about him to a certain degree. But I'm going to begin with Putin's speech because it is a most extraordinary one very unlike any speech that he has given at any time in the conflict up to now. Now, I'm not going to read the entire speech because even though by Putin's standards it is not especially long, the parts of it which I find especially remarkable come at the beginning, and I'm going to focus mostly on that part of his speech. Anyway, let me read from the Kremlin's website what Putin says, the parts of the speech that I personally consider important. So he begins by saying that Russia and the members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization have a military political organization. He says that he's been asked to discuss the conflict in Ukraine, and he is going to do so. And then he gets, after these brief introductory words, directly to the point. And he says this: as is known, Western officials in early November gave permission for the Ukrainian armed forces to strike the territory of the Russian Federation with Western-made long-range precision weapons. We have repeatedly drawn attention to the fact that this means the direct involvement of these countries in an armed conflict, since the use of these weapons without the direct participation of military personnel and military specialists from the relevant NATO countries is simply impossible. As you know, despite our warnings about the danger of escalation of the conflict, strikes on our territory were nevertheless carried out in Bryansk and Kursk region with American ATACMS and British Storm Shadow missiles. The consequences of these attacks and the damage caused to us were discussed in my statement on November 21st. And then we start with the section of his speech, which, as I said, I think has no precedent in any earlier speeches that Putin has given, because it is a discussion by Putin of the various capabilities of certain Western weapon systems by comparison with their Russian analogues. It discloses a significant amount of information that the Russians have about the weapon systems of the West, information which I suspect is classified, and it gives also further information about additional information that the Russians have about weapon systems, Western weapon systems, which, however, he does not provide further elucidation on. Anyway, let's begin. Some colleagues, this is now Putin speaking, some colleagues ask about this, that the Russian analog of all three modifications of the ATACMS is a missile system, the Iskander, and its various modifications. The mass of the warhead in TNT equivalent is approximately the same. The range of Iskander is greater. The new American missile, the PRSM, this is the one that is eventually going to replace the ATACMS, though it is still in development and early test. Anyway, he says the new American missile, PRSM, in parameters does not exceed Russian analogues in any way. So he says it is not superior to the Iskander. The Iskander is superior to the ATACMS and at least equivalent to the PRSM. He then discusses British, French and German missiles. He says the air-launched Storm Shadow missile, the French Scalp and the German Taurus have a warhead of about 450 to 480 kilograms of TNT equivalent and a range of 500 to 650 kilometers. 650 is the German Taurus missile. Now, I understand myself that the Taurus has a longer range than this, but I suspect that Putin is right and that, in fact, the real range of the Taurus is less. I've heard this from others as well, and I suspect that Putin here is giving us the actual range of the Taurus missile as opposed to the range that is quoted in the various literature that has been published about the Taurus, which I suspect is intended basically to act as a spur for the ultimate marketing and selling of this missile. Anyway, Putin then goes on to say this. The Russian equivalent of these systems, that is to say the Storm Shadow, the Scalp and the Taurus, is the KH-101 air-launched missile. It is a warhead comparable in power, but significantly exceeds each of the European-made systems in range. That is an understatement. The KH-101 has a range, can have a range of over 1,000 kilometers. The new American PRSM missile, as I have already said, and JASSMs, that's the missile that Ukraine is likely to be supplied and which is air-launched, are inferior in their characteristics to their Russian counterparts. We know, this is the most extraordinary paragraph of all, we know how many of these weapon systems are in service with a potential enemy, how many are in warehouses, where they are located specifically, how many weapons have been delivered to Ukraine, and how many are planned to be delivered. Now, that is an astonishing paragraph. One wonders whether it is true. If it is true, it suggests that the Russians have access to extremely secret information. That's all I would say. And one wonders how they have obtained it. He says that he knows, the Russians know how many of these missiles are in warehouses. So they know what the size of the stockpiles of these systems, missiles, is. They know where these warehouses, where these stockpiles are located, where these warehouses are. They know how many of these missiles have been delivered to Ukraine and how many are planned to be delivered to Ukraine. That, for me, is the most extraordinary paragraph of all. I am going to make a guess that all of the West's various intelligence agencies, the CIA, MI6, MI5, the German BND, the French intelligence systems, they're going to be focusing mostly on this paragraph. They'll be frantically wondering whether what Putin is saying is really true. There'll be all sorts of questions as to how the Russians have this information, and, well, all sorts of things, no doubt, are going to happen as the West tries to work out whether Putin is telling the truth, and if he is, how the Russians have obtained this information. Now, for Putin to say this, and for this to be published like this by the Kremlin, I am going to suggest that it almost certainly means that the Russians actually do have this information. I don't think the Kremlin would publish a comment of this kind if the Russians didn't. Certainly not putting it in Putin's mouth in this way. And it would also suggest that the Russians are very confident that regardless of what the West does. The disclosure that the Russians have this information will not compromise Russia's ability to continue to acquire this information. Anyway, there we are. And then Putin goes on to say this: as for the production of corresponding missile systems, the corresponding equipment, in Russia it is 10 times greater than the total production of all NATO countries combined. And next year, this production will increase by another 25 to 30%. So he's giving us figures for production rates. Here these figures might be a little less impressive than they seem, because, as I've already said, to my knowledge, ATACMS production basically stopped in the mid-2000s. Storm Shadow production is at a very low rate. I know nothing about production of the Scalp, and Taurus missile production has also now stopped. So when the Russians say that they're producing 10 times more of these missiles than the West is, they may not actually be giving away very much, because if you multiply the number 0 by 10, you will actually get 0. It's a little bit misleading. It sounds more dramatic than it perhaps really is. But I'm going to suggest that, in fact, the KH-101 is also possibly an equivalent to the American Tomahawk missile, which I believe is also still in production. And based on what Putin is saying, the Russians are producing missiles, not just these specific missiles, but missiles generally of this kind, tactical and medium-range missiles, at a rate 10 times that of the collective West, which, incidentally, I suspect is probably true. And of course, he says that they will increase their production further by 25 to 30% next year. And then he goes on to say, we see that the leaders of the Kiev regime are begging their masters for other military equipment. Let no one forget about the Kalibr system. This is the sea-launched subsonic cruise missile, which equips Russian naval ships. The Kinzhal, which is, of course, a hypersonic system launched by the MiG-31 fighter jet. And the Zircon hypersonic missile systems. The Zircon is a ship-launched hypersonic cruise missile. It has been used to a limited degree in action in Ukraine. There is considerable uncertainty in the West as to how exactly it operates, though it's widely assumed that it uses some kind of air-breathing engine. Anyway, he says these systems we have in our arsenal, they have no analogues in the world in terms of their characteristics. Their production is also increasing and is in full swing. And then he goes on to say, in our menu of this class of products, so to speak, other products may appear in the near future. As they say in such cases, the client will certainly be satisfied. This is a very tantalizing statement by Putin, but he does appear to be saying that the Russians have other missiles that they're developing as well, and that they could be placed in service, he says, in the near future. Whether that means in the next couple of weeks, or the next couple of months, or the next couple of years, I'm not going to try and speculate. We can only guess, and I'm not going to even try I'm not going to try and guess what nature of weapons he is talking about. I will say this: I have heard reports that a hypersonic air-launched missile is in the process of development for Russia's Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighter jet. It's a much smaller system dimensionally than any of the other ones that we've discussed up to this point, and it can apparently be carried inside the inside the Sukhoi 57 so that it doesn't compromise the Sukhoi 57's stealth capabilities. But I'm not going to pretend that I have much knowledge or understanding of these topics, so as I said, I'm not going to speculate further about this. And then Putin goes on to say, by the way, these are the very weapons systems that we used over the last 2 days in response to the continued ATACMS missile strikes on Russian territory. In total, 100 systems were used, 100 missiles of various classes, which I just mentioned, and 466 attack drones. He's talking about the attack, the enormous missile attack that has been underway, that the Russians have conducted against Ukraine, which I mentioned at the outset of this program. He says that it has been underway over the last 2 days. Strictly speaking, that is true, in the sense that it began shortly before midnight, and then it continued into the early hours of this morning. And then he goes on to say, last night we carried out a comprehensive strike using 90 missiles of similar classes and 100 drones. 17 targets were hit. These were military facilities, defense industry facilities, and their support systems. I repeat once again, these strikes on our part also took place in response to the ongoing strikes on Russian territory by American ATACMS missiles. As I have said many times, there will always be a response from our side. So if the West and Ukraine conduct attacks on Russia, the Russians will reciprocate. But then he again starts on very interesting topics. Finally, the newest hypersonic strike system, Oreshnik, is a non-nuclear version. We were forced to test it in combat conditions, forced, as I already said, in response to the Western weapon strikes on the territory of Bryansk and Kursk regions with ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles. Of course, there are no analogues of Oreshnik in the world, and I think such analogues will not appear soon. Let me remind you once again how Oreshnik works, and that he discusses some of the properties of the Oreshnik system. And this is where people like Millennium 7, the engineer of Millennium 7, and Professor Postol are being provided by Putin with a significant amount of information, as are, of course, the various engineers and technicians who develop the weapon systems used by the Western powers and the intelligence officials of those powers. And this is what Putin said. Dozens of warheads, homing units. So this appears to confirm that these are indeed independently targeted warheads. They have their engines and they can maneuver and they can be maneuvered to attack the target. Dozens of warheads, homing units, attack the target at a speed of Mach 10, which is about 3 kilometers per second. The temperature of the striking elements reaches 4,000 degrees. If my memory serves me right, the temperature on the surface of the sun is 5,500 to 6,000 degrees. This is, of course, centigrade. Therefore, everything that is in the epicenter of the explosion is divided into fractions, into elementary particles, turns essentially into dust. The missile hits even highly protected objects located at great depth. Now, yesterday, before Putin actually made this speech, I received fascinating information about the strike by the Oreshnik on the Yuzhmash factory from a source. The source has significant information, much of it obtained quite openly, apparently, from material that has been circulating within the Russian parliament, the Duma. The Russian government has been briefing MPs of the Russian parliament. The Russian government has been briefing MPs of the Russian parliament about the effectiveness of the Oreshnik strike. And, well, the result is that this information can be accessed, and it has provided an utterly devastating picture of the effectiveness of this strike. It seems that the warheads operating at these incredible speeds were able to penetrate into the underground facilities of the factory, that massive destruction has been caused. The machinery and many of the plants of the factory have been rendered, well, they've been reduced to ruins and are inoperable. The billions of dollars of damage have been caused, such as would make it all but impossible to put the factory back in production. And perhaps most disturbingly, though I want to stress this is information which is been supplied to me, but cannot be corroborated up to now. It seems that hundreds of people in the factory were wounded and killed, including perhaps some Western engineers who were also there. And this source has suggested that the factory was actually working on developing various Ukrainian missile systems, new missile systems, that the Russians were aware of these missile systems being developed, and that, in effect, the strike has completely shut down all of these programs. So, apparently a devastating strike. The person has also provided me with photographs, which appear to be from satellites. I can't myself I'm not able to understand these photographs, but this is a source that I consider very authoritative. He has consistently provided me with information which has turned out to be true. So I'm going to go along very much with what he says. Bear in mind that Ukraine and the West have provided up to now no photographs or information themselves about damage to the Yuzhmash factory, so that we can only piece reports together from reports like the one I've just discussed. And what this source tells me corresponds with what Putin has just said. Now, I received an email from that indefatigable commentator, incredibly insightful commentator, about the conflict, about many other matters, who is, of course, Eve Smith of Naked Capitalism. She has suggested that, in fact, the warheads of the Oreshnik system might actually be designed to operate without explosives. And she has suggested also that the sheer effect of warheads striking a target at hypersonic speeds above Mach 10, would be enough to cause exactly the kind of damage that Putin is describing. These words of Putin effectively corroborate, or so it seems to me, what Eve Smith said. Now, Having said this, I ought to say that the Oreshnik is still a system under development. Putin is careful to make clear that this was still only a test strike. It could be that in time the warheads will be further refined and that they could be filled with explosives, and it could very well be the Hextol explosive or a derivative that the other source has spoken about. But it seems that in terms of the strike on the Yuzhmash factory, the warheads, the damage done by the warheads was purely as a result of the kinetic impact. But the kinetic impact was massive, and the damage would have been massive as well. Anyway, Putin then goes on to say this: according to military and technical experts, in the case of a massive group use of these missiles, and that's a very interesting fact, it looks as if these missiles, the Oreshniks, are intended to be or could be used with several engaging in a single strike against a single target. That is several Oreshniks at once in a cluster in one strike. Its power, the power of its strike, would be comparable to the use of a nuclear weapon. Although Oreshnik is, of course, not a weapon of mass destruction, firstly because, and this was confirmed by the test on November 21st, this weapon is highly accurate, and second, and most important, there is no nuclear charge here, and therefore no nuclear contamination after use. Today, we have several ready-to-use products of this kind. So Russia already has a stockpile of Oreshniks. He doesn't tell us how many. Of course, as has already been said, we will respond to the ongoing strikes on Russian territory by long-range missiles of Western manufacture, including by possibly continuing to test the Oreshnik in combat conditions, as was done on November 21st. That is a very heavy hint that another Oreshnik strike is coming. And then he goes on to say, currently, the Defense Ministry and the General Staff of the Russian Army are selecting targets for destruction on the territory of Ukraine. Now, notice that. That's very interesting. We are being told that not only is it likely that there will be another Oreshnik strike against Ukraine, but that the strike will be against Ukraine. The Russians, Putin himself, have said that they reserve the right to conduct strikes against targets in Europe, against American and NATO targets around the world. But for the moment, they are confining themselves to targets inside Ukraine with the Oreshnik system. And that is what I personally expected would be the case. I said that I thought it unlikely that President Putin would want to escalate the situation further still by conducting strikes with a system like the Oreshnik against targets in, say, Europe, escalating the situation to the point when it became impossible for President Trump to conduct negotiations with Russia of any sort, let alone negotiations to try to bring an end to the conflict in Ukraine, with also, of course, the further risk of an uncontrolled escalation. So the next Oreshnik strike will be against a target in Ukraine, and Putin has just confirmed this. And then he tells us what the target of the strike might be. These could be military facilities, defense industry enterprises like Yuzhmash, or decision-making centers in Kiev. In other words, there might be an attack on Kiev itself, and this time, given the incredible power of the Oreshnik system, it could be focused, it could take the form of a decapitation strike against Ukraine's political leadership. Now, saying that, I've been informed by the same source who tell me about the extent of the damage on the Yuzhmash factory, that the Russians, prior to the strike on Yuzhmash, spread misinformation that the strike would be, in fact, on some facility in Kiev itself. And the panic-stricken rush of Western diplomats out of Kiev was connected to that information. For the record, I understand that some Western embassies in Kiev remain closed. Well, this statement of Putin's is not going to encourage them to reopen. It could be that we will again get a scuttle of diplomats out of Kiev following this comment. Given that the Oreshnik is certainly capable of penetrating deep bunkers, and given that Putin is obviously hinting that the Russians have a very, very detailed understanding of the layout of Ukraine's and the West's complexes, there is at least a possibility that the Russians know where those bunkers are. I personally would not be surprised if, as the days and the weeks progress, we start to see various Ukrainian officials and their teams starting to be relocated out of Kiev also. Just saying. And then he goes on to say, just to remind everybody, moreover, the Kiev regime has repeatedly attempted to strike at objects of national importance in Russia, St. Petersburg and Moscow, and these attempts continue. And then he goes on to say, serial production of Oreshnik has begun. Ultimately, the means of destruction will be selected by us, depending on the nature of the targets selected for destruction and the threats created to the Russian Federation. And then he goes on to discuss in his speech that the Oreshnik is an incredibly powerful weapon with no analogue in the world, but it cannot win the war by itself. The people who are winning the war for Russia in Ukraine are the Russian soldiers who are fighting on the battlefield. He has a great deal to say about them. And he also has, again, some extremely harsh things to say about the Ukrainian leadership. He, again, specifically denies their legitimacy. He says that without negotiations, they have no authority to give orders to anyone, including Ukraine's armed forces, that they are usurpers, and, well, he's made it fairly clear that as far as he's concerned, their right to conduct negotiations with Russia is significantly open to doubt. So there we are, a very extraordinary speech by Putin. Oreshnik in production. Russia has several of them. The Russians are going to conduct the next Oreshnik strike within Ukraine itself. That strike might target decision-making centers, for example, Zelensky himself or his officials. That Kiev, therefore, has become unsafe, that the Russians have not, however, limited themselves to the nature of the strikes that they're going to conduct, and that the Russians are producing 10 times more missiles than the collective West is, and that their missiles generally have superior properties to the Western ones. It's an astonishing speech. As I said, a speech that intelligence officials across the West are going to spend a huge amount of time dissecting and discussing and thinking about and trying to work out its various implications. Now, a speech of this kind is only given by a leader who is in a very confident position, both about the security of the sources that his government is accessing as it obtains information about the adversary side, but also a leader who is clearly very confident about the progress of the war, who feels, in other words, that he is winning the war, which actually he is. The missile strike that I discussed at the start of this program, and which Putin discussed in this speech, has been absolutely devastating. The Ukrainian energy system, which has been the main target, so far as I can see, is once again, practically in a state of collapse. The air defense system has proved effectively ineffectual. The Ukrainians have again made the usual exaggerated claims that they've been able to shoot down 80%, or was it 90% of the missiles that the Russians launched. Something which, if true, would make the extent of the blackouts and the energy crisis across Ukraine inexplicable. But we don't have to worry or think about the accuracy of these Ukrainian claims, because no less a person than General Syrskyi, the current commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, some months ago provided a breakdown of the number of missiles, Russian missiles, that the Ukrainians had successfully shot down. And suffice to say, it turned out to be significantly, orders of magnitude less than these various claims of successful missile interceptions that we've been reading about in the West. So, another massive missile strike. And I ought to say, and I'm not going to again in this program discuss the details of the fighting, but the Russian offensive continues unabated. The Russians continue to advance right across the front line. And this morning I heard reports that the Russians are now very close to pushing the Ukrainians finally out of Chasiv Yar, and that the various villages south of Kurakovo have mostly fallen under Russian control. So alongside Yekaterinovka and Ilinka, other villages in that area, Dalnie, Yelizavetka, others have also fallen. The Ukrainians are hurriedly retreating from this territory. And of course, the Russian attack on Velikaya, Novosilka is also ongoing as well. And in fact, there's been an article in CNN which also talks about the incredibly bleak situation on the battlefronts for Ukraine. It made the extraordinary, I understand, it's made extraordinary claims about the Battle of Selidovo, which I don't take especially seriously, by the way, but it talks about catastrophic shortages of manpower faced by the Ukrainian army. And we have heard reports that the Biden administration is now again pressuring Ukraine to extend the draft right down to include men of the 18-year-old age group and upward to try to make up for combat losses and to match the Russians on the battlefields. Of course, there is no explanation, no serious thought, no discussion about how these men are going to be trained in time, about their willingness to fight, and of course no discussion either about the incredible demographic crisis that this will cause to Ukraine, and about the terrible tragedy for all the young men involved. I have to say that this constant urging and bullying of Ukraine to enlist more and more of its people, to throw them into the meat grinder, which is what the battle lines in Ukraine have become, this constant demand for this that one gets from people in the West, I staggers and horrifies me by its cynicism and ruthlessness. These are not even Western people. They're not the citizens of our own country. We are demanding that another country sacrifice its youth in order to win some kind of proxy war against the Russians, in which we seem to be making some sort of ideological point. Those who pretend that they are defending Ukraine, that they care about Ukraine as a result of this extraordinary demand, are exposing the reality, which, as far as I'm concerned, what it shows is that they don't care about Ukraine at all. As far as they are concerned, Ukraine is just another piece on the grand chessboard, to borrow a phrase from that former US policymaker Zbigniew Brzezinski with his frightful book. Anyway, there we are. So that's Putin. That's the state of the war at the moment. I'm going to express a view. I think that before, certainly Kurakovo, and I understand Joseph Yar are in their last days. Toret's probably true also. I think that when Kurakovo and Velikaya Novosilka fall, there will be a rapid collapse of Ukrainian defences westwards. And I also think that the Russian attack on Pokrovsk that will follow will probably see the collapse of Ukrainian defences in that town much quicker than many people expect. And I think it is more likely than not that the Russians will be in force on the Dnieper by midwinter. A winter that in Ukraine and across Europe looks like it is going to be very cold. And, well, I ought to say that on the vexed question of whether the Russians have the capability to destroy the Dnieper bridges with the Oreshnik, there can be absolutely no doubt whatsoever that they do. They are in a position at any time to destroy the bridges, to cut off the Ukrainian army east of the Dnieper, to create a critical situation for the Ukrainian armed forces there. And the fact that they have not done this up to now begs many questions, the obvious one of which is, are they preserving the bridges across the Dnieper because they're thinking that at some point they might want to use them themselves? In which case, at some point over the next year or so, we might start to see the Russian army operating in force west of the Dnieper as well, in which case, well, everything that we have been talking about, the viability of Ukraine, will become moot, because at that point, if the Russians operate in force west of the Dnieper, it'll be, in my opinion, the death blow to Ukraine. I should stress, I mean, in central Ukraine, in Zaporozhye, Dnipro, and in those places. Incidentally, yesterday, I saw a report somewhere, I think it was on a Russian Telegram channel, that Russian troops have now entered Dnipropetrovsk region, Dnipro region, so that they have now expanded their area of control, getting closer to the Dnieper. But I should say that I place low reliability on this report, which doesn't, of course, mean necessarily that it is untrue. Anyway, there it is. I now want to discuss the appointment of General Kellogg, because in foreign policy terms, this is the single most important appointment, in the short term at least, that President Trump has made. Now, again, I wish to here express my thanks to Jeff Roberts for providing me with the so-called plan that General Kellogg and General Kellogg partly drafted. It was General Kellogg, Keith Kellogg, and Fred Fleitz. It dates from the April 11th, 2024. It is not a plan. I want to make this absolutely clear, because now that I've read this document properly, I can see that attempts to misrepresent it as a plan are completely wrong and very misleading. It is not a plan. It is, in fact, entitled as a research report for the Center for American Security, which is a part of the America First Policy Institute. And the title of this document, which nowhere contains the word plan, as far as I can see, is America First, Russia and Ukraine. And the date is very important, April 11th, 2024. So this document is drafted at around the time when it became clear that Donald Trump would become the Republican Party's candidate in the election for the presidency, which took place on the 5th of November, 2024. This is an election document. When you read it, it becomes absolutely clear. It is a document written in the context of the presidential election in the United States, which has now happened. And the purpose of this document is not to provide Donald Trump with some sort of detailed plan about how he is going to end the conflict in Ukraine. It is to provide him with a framework, a structure that he can use, or he could use, in the event that the question of Ukraine came up during the election. Donald Trump's Democratic opponents consistently argued that Trump was weak, soft on Ukraine, far too sympathetic to Vladimir Putin. He was going to surrender Ukraine, give it away to the Russians, that he was, in other words, still somebody ultimately in Putin's pocket. What this report is clearly intended to do is both to refute that claim, putting Trump in a stronger position when faced by attacks of this kind, whilst also explaining why Trump and the United States, Trump if elected, and the United States should move as quickly as possible to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end. And it is the second part of this, the second, which in some ways is the most interesting. Now, that brings me to the authors of this report. Now, I don't pretend that I know very much about Fred flights, but General Kellogg, Keith Kellogg, has just been appointed Donald Trump's envoy to try to get the Russians and the Ukrainians talking to each other. And in light of that, I decided to do some research about him, and I discovered that he is a US Army general, that he was born in 1944, that he is therefore 80 years old, that he therefore lived right through the Cold War and served in the US Armed Forces during a significant part of the Cold War, that he has seen service in the US military in the wars in Vietnam and in the Middle East, and that he is therefore a very experienced man indeed. And he is someone who therefore has a clear memory of the Cold War, of how the relations between the superpowers of that period, the United States and the Soviet Union, were conducted, the kind of red lines they each had, the fact, for example, that throughout the Cold War, neither of them conducted strikes against the other. And as the report shows, he does have, along with Fred flights, some grasp of wider geopolitical strategy, as framed during the period of the Cold War, when the world was bipolar, not unipolar as it became after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. A bipolar world, of course, approximates more closely to the multipolar world we have today, when there are more constraints on American power than there were during the unipolar moment. And that background does provide a certain level of insight to this report. The other thing I discovered about General Kellogg is that he does have a significant connections to Donald Trump. He was in touch with Donald Trump before Donald Trump was first elected president in 2016. He was briefly Donald Trump's interim national security advisor after Donald Trump's first pick at national security advisor, Mike Flynn, was forced from his job in, I seem to remember, January 2017. Kellogg was then appointed to be Vice President Mike Pence's national security advisor. But in practice and in fact, he continued to provide advice to President Trump throughout the period of Donald Trump's first term. And he is therefore somebody with a significant history with Donald Trump, and as is consistent with every other pick that Trump has made to his administration, Kellogg is somebody who has shown that he is loyal to Trump. I think loyal in this case is perhaps not quite the correct word, but anyway, he stood by Trump through many of the problems that beset his first term. He clearly did not believe that Trump was an agent of the Russians. He spoke out against the first Trump impeachment. He said that there was nothing improper about the Trump-Zelensky telephone call, which was the foundation of that impeachment. About that, by the way, Kellogg is obviously right. So he is somebody with significant experience and somebody who Donald Trump knows very well and presumably trusts and has found that he can trust. Now, someone born in 1944 is also quite elderly, if you will forgive me saying so. He is 80. That doesn't perhaps suggest that he is the most dynamic man around. That might have an effect on his ability to conduct diplomacy, but at least, judging by this report, he does understand the necessity of it. And that brings me to the report itself. And I want to stress that it is a report, it is not a plan. Now, the report is a very mixed bag of things. But the best way to understand it is, again, as an election document, because its underlying theme is that it utterly eviscerates, it completely pulps to pieces the Biden administration's entire approach to the conflict in Ukraine. It says that Biden, far from engaging with the Russians and with Putin and taking their concerns seriously, on the contrary, behaved incredibly provocatively towards them, that when the Russians made clear their major concerns about potential Ukrainian entry into NATO, the United States should have negotiated with the Russians seriously about that concern, knowing that there was a risk of war if they did not, and that the Biden administration failed to do that. The article clearly says, the report clearly says, that the entire war was completely avoidable, and it places the entire blame for the war on a succession of catastrophic misjudgments and errors by the Biden administration. It also severely takes the Biden administration to task for the way it has handled the war. It is said that the Biden administration has at no time developed a strategy either for Ukraine achieving victory, unattainable though that clearly is, but remember, as I said, that this is an election document, nor has it sought some pathway to a negotiated settlement. And about that, the report is absolutely right. The report says that instead of doing that, the Biden administration conducted the conflict in Ukraine as a proxy war against Russia, that it has sacrificed Ukraine to that objective, causing terrible suffering and devastation in that country, and that far from strengthening the position of the United States by waging this proxy war against Russia on the territory of Ukraine, all that it has managed to do, quite apart from the destruction of Ukraine itself, is that it has depleted to dangerous levels America's own military arsenals, whilst at the same time strengthening the relationship between China and Russia. Now, those are the good things in the report. There are other things with which I don't agree. The report, for example, argues that in order to prevent a war between Russia and Ukraine, the United States should have engaged not just in diplomacy, but also in a major program to arm Ukraine before the war began. In my opinion, had anything like that been done, the effect would have been to bring on the war more quickly. The Russians were already becoming concerned at the extent, the pace of Ukraine's armament. They were already expressing themselves very forcefully about this. And as I said, if the advice in this report had been followed before the war began, then all it would have done would have been to bring the war, to cause the war to happen much sooner than would otherwise have been the case. But of course, this thing about arming Ukraine is the failure to arm Ukraine is also a way of criticizing and blaming the Biden administration. The fact that the Biden administration was not providing Ukraine with the weapons it needed in order to deter the Russians before the war started and in order to successfully resist the Russians after the war started. It should be seen, at least in part, as criticism, providing Trump with talking points to criticize the Biden specifically and the Biden administration in the context of an election campaign, which when the report was written in April 2024, most people expected, still expect, in fact everybody still expected, would be between Biden and Trump. So clearly it's intended to convey the impression that, to allay the impression that Trump himself was weak or would have been weak towards the Russians. On the contrary, it was Biden who was confused, chaotic, has no clear strategy about what to do, is using Ukraine as a pawn to wage a proxy war, is destroying Ukraine in the process, is creating massive problems for the United States, and is reinforcing the alliance between China and Russia. As I say, this is a report written in the context of a presidential campaign. But it does, even as it makes these frankly bad points, it does concede the importance of diplomacy. The report goes out of its way to say that Trump, unlike Biden, always treated with Putin personally with respect, understood that Putin was the leader of an important, not just an important, but of a very powerful country, a great power, always treated him with that level of respect, always sought to engage with the Russians in a way that sought acceptable solutions, and that the mantra of as long as it takes is completely wrong and is leading the United States down a blind alley and Ukraine towards irretrievable disaster. So, read in that way, one can perhaps see this report in a slightly different way than one might otherwise have done. Now, again, there are lots of other things. I mean, it praises Trump for his sanctions against Nord Stream. It says that in order to press the Russians, to push the Russians into negotiations with Ukraine, the United States might provide the Russians with some degree of limited sanctions relief, but the sanctions relief should be tempered and that there should be no general lifting of sanctions until there is a final negotiated agreement between Russia and Ukraine. It accepts that Ukraine is going to have to make major concessions to the Russians, though it doesn't spell them out. And the comment, which has caused many people including myself, the most concern, which is the issue of delaying Ukraine's NATO entry. Well, if one actually reads the report carefully, that isn't quite what the report says. What the report says is that in order to persuade Putin and the Russians to agree to negotiations, the Russians should be told that the United States is prepared to put off discussion of Ukraine's NATO membership for an extended period. I'll read the exact words. To convince Putin to join peace talks, President Biden and other NATO leaders, he's talking about Biden now, not Trump, should offer to put off NATO membership for Ukraine for an extended period in exchange for a comprehensive and verifiable peace deal with security guarantees. So that advice is not directed at Trump. It's directed at Biden, who was the president, who is of course still the president, but was obviously still the president at the time when this report was written. Note that this offer to put off NATO membership for an extended period is intended to convince Putin to join peace talks. But, of course, there's no need to convince Putin to join peace talks because, as Putin has repeatedly pointed out, he is always ready to sit down and negotiate. He has never rejected negotiations. So this comment about putting off NATO membership for Ukraine for an extended period in order to convince Putin to join peace talks really isn't necessary. Now, whether General Kellogg himself knows this, I am not sure. But I suspect that by now he probably does. So there it is. A very different document from the one that I'd been led to think. It's another example, by the way, of why one should be extremely careful before making assumptions based on what one reads in third-party sources. So, where does all this leave us? What is General Kellogg, therefore, going to do? Well, I'm going to suggest that understanding this report does somewhat change the picture. It does seem as if General Kellogg is someone who does at least understand the need for negotiations, and that he does also seem to understand the need for bringing this proxy war between Russia and the United States, which is being fought out on the territory of Ukraine, to an end. Since he is being appointed a peace envoy, I presume this means that he's actually going to travel to Moscow and that he's going to be meeting with the Russian officials, with Putin and Lavrov and perhaps Shoigu and the other, and Belarus, for all I know, and will be listening to what they have to say. Putin in Astana, in this meeting in Kazakhstan, where he is presently attending, seemed to take an optimistic view about the prospects of negotiations, at least of discussions with the Americans. He spoke of Trump being an intelligent person, somebody who was fully able to find a solution. And I've tended to find that when people start to talk with each other, when views are exchanged, then someone like General Kellogg, who has come to things from the abstract, when he hears what the Russians actually have to say, he's probably going to modify his views accordingly. I think he's going to find it much more difficult to make much more progress with the Ukrainians. as I said, Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff, is still speaking about pushing the Russians back to the starting positions before the special military operation began, all the way back to their positions in February 2022, which of course isn't going to happen. But based on my reading of this report, I am mildly more optimistic about General Kellogg and about what he might achieve than I had been previously. Let me repeat again, there's an awful lot that can go wrong. I don't get the impression that Zelensky himself is keen on negotiations at all. He continues to insist on impossible conditions. I think that, by contrast, the Russians might find in Kellogg an interlocutor, someone who remembers how things used to be done during the Cold War, and with whom they might be able to work with, at least to some degree. No one should assume from this that peace in Ukraine is likely. I'm afraid the war will certainly continue. If there is going to be a negotiation process put in place, it will probably last for months, at the very least. And in the meantime, the Russians will continue their offensive. I still believe, in fact, I firmly believe, that the outcome of this war is going to be determined on the battlefields. And to repeat again what I said earlier in the programme, I think the decisive moment, the key moment when it become clear, not just that Ukraine is losing the war, but that the war is actually lost, will come when the Russians reach the Dnieper, and especially once they cross it, which, by the way, I think they will. So, lots to wait and think about and see. In the meantime, I'm going to finish my programme today. This has been a lengthy discussion of two important documents, Putin's speech and the Kellogg report. I will call it the Kellogg report for want of any better name. To stress again, it is not a Kellogg plan. The report refers to itself as a report. It does not claim to be a plan, and the proposal to delay entry, the suggestion to delay Ukraine's entry into NATO by 10 years was directed not at Trump, but at Biden, and was intended to induce Putin to agree to negotiations, which of course is unnecessary, because Putin has always actually said that he is open for negotiations. The report itself acknowledges Russian concerns about NATO, and it leaves Trump with complete discretion as to what he decides on the issue of NATO and Ukraine. So I'm not taking out any champagne corks, let me be absolutely clear. I'm not saying that, we're going to get peace in the next few weeks or the next few months. It's just that the appointment of Kellogg makes rather more sense than I had thought just a few hours ago. Anyway, in the meantime, let me say again that lots of things are going on in other places in the world. The jihadi fighters have launched an offensive in Syria towards Aleppo. I'm going to discuss that much more detail in my programme tomorrow. Alex Christoforo and I have just done another programme on the perennial topic of the ruble. This subject always comes back at this time of year. I am very tired and bored about discussing these things, but I will do so again tomorrow. As I said, we've already done a program on the Duran, but I will cover it also on this channel. To anticipate what I'm going to say, it is, in my opinion, much ado about nothing. But anyway, this is where I finish today's program. More from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. And in the meantime, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop. Links under this video. Remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if you've liked this video. And all that's left for me is to wish you a very good day.